Okay, let's unpack this. For, nearly 2 millennia, the book of Revelation, that final, most enigmatic text of the Christian Bible, it's held this really unique, kind of persistent grip on our imagination, both culturally and
It
religiously.
really has.
Yeah.
The imagery is just so potent.
Exactly. Its pages are filled with this maelstrom of vivid, often pretty unsettling symbols. You've got seven-headed beasts, catastrophic plagues, and then there's that infamous, luxurious city, Babylon.
Mm-hmm. Unforgettable stuff.
But here's where it gets, well, really interesting and maybe a bit uncanny today. In our century, the 21st, this ancient text seems to have found startling new relevance.
How so?
Well, think about the rapid growth of artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces like Neuralink, global surveillance systems, the whole push towards cashless societies, even the intense political polarization we see.
Okay.
All of these modern phenomena seem to resonate, sometimes almost eerily, with Revelation's ancient prophecies about control and deception.
It's truly fascinating, isn't it, how these symbols, centuries old, suddenly feel like they could be describing things happening right now. It creates this landscape that resonates so strongly with Revelation's prophecies.
Yeah.
Now, for this deep dive, just to be clear, our mission isn't really about predicting the future. We're not setting timetables or offering, the definitive interpretation. History shows that can be, well, a tricky business.
Right.
Instead, what we want to explore is why and how these ancient symbols are being mapped onto these modern phenomena. Because the core message of Revelation, I think, isn't ultimately about cracking some secret code for the end times.
What is it then?
It's about a profound and timeless question. It's about allegiance. It's about worship. It's this powerful call to resist idolatry and oppression, whether you're facing the Roman Empire in the first century or navigating the complexities of our own time.
Okay, so if we want to dig into Revelation today with all that modern stuff swirling around, how do we even start to read it? It's not like a normal history book or even just a straightforward letter, is it?
No, exactly. That's the first hurdle, you could say.
Right.
Because it's actually this fascinating blend of different literary forms all woven together.
Like what?
Well, first, the book's very first word in Greek is apocalypsis,
Which means?
unveiling. So as an apocalypse, it uses this highly symbolic visionary language. Think dreams, visions. It's meant to pull back the curtain on earthly events, reveal a transcendent heavenly perspective. It often works in these stark contrasts, earth versus heaven, this age versus the age to come.
To show what's really going on behind the scenes.
Pretty much. And its main goal, in that sense, is to offer hope, especially to those being oppressed, by showing God's ultimate sovereignty over history.
Okay, so unveiling. What else?
It also explicitly calls itself prophecy. This connects it directly back to those powerful Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel.
Right.
So that means it was intended both to foretell future events, yes, but also, crucially, to foretell God's message. It's a strong call to faithfulness for its immediate audience.
And then there's that third layer, which I think sometimes gets missed. It's actually framed as a letter, right?
Yeah.
Your epistle.
That's so important. It's structured as a circular letter sent to 7 specific real-life churches in Roman Asia Minor places like Ephesus, Smyrna.
So it wasn't just floating in the ether, it was grounded.
Exactly. It roots all these grand cosmic visions right back into the concrete realities those people were facing. They were dealing with real threats, persecution from the Roman state, huge pressure to participate in the emperor cult.
And those wild symbols of the beasts, the numbers they would have understood them.
The idea is that those symbols were intended to be transparent or at least resonant to them. They draw heavily on imagery from their scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, things that would click for a first century Jewish Christian reader.
Okay, so given all that complexity, apocalypse, prophecy, letter, it's really no surprise that over the centuries, people have wrestled with how to make sense of it all. This led to these, 4 main schools of interpretation?
That's right. And they offer fundamentally different keys to unlocking its meaning. Sometimes they're even, mutually exclusive.
Let's break those down. What's the first one?
Okay, first you have the preterist view. Preter comes from the Latin for past.
Past, so it already happened.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
This view argues that most, if not all, of Revelation's prophecies were actually fulfilled back in the first century AD. It reads like a commentary on events like the Roman-Jewish War, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, or perhaps the persecution under emperors like Nero or Domitian.
So in that view, Babylon the Great would be
The Roman Empire and the beast. That's usually interpreted as the Roman imperial system itself, or maybe a specific emperor.
And the famous 666?
Ah, yes. Within preterism, that's widely understood using gematria, the ancient practice where letters have numerical values. It calculates out to Nero Caesar in Hebrew or Greek letters.
Fascinating. Okay, what's next?
Then you have the historicist view. This one sees Revelation as a kind of continuous chronological map of Western history, particularly church history, from the first century right up to the present day.
So it's like unfolding throughout history.
Exactly. This was actually the dominant view for a long time, especially among the Protestant reformers. They famously identified figures like the papacy as the Antichrist, or the beast described in Revelation.
But you don't hear as much about this view in scholarly circles today, right?
Not so much, no. It's largely fallen out of favor, mainly because interpretations can seem quite subjective. People were constantly trying to map current events onto the prophecies.
Okay, so past continuous history. What else?
The futurist view. This one says, hold on, most of this hasn't happened yet.
This is the one you hear about a lot in popular culture, right? End time stuff.
Very much so. It argues that the book of Revelation, especially from chapter 4 onwards, describes events that are yet to be fulfilled. They'll happen in a relatively concentrated period at the very end of history, often called the tribulation. This view tends towards a more literal interpretation of the plagues, the battles, the figures involved. It's heavily associated with modern dispensationalist theology.
And the last one.
The idealist view, sometimes called the spiritual or symbolic view. This one takes a very different approach. It reads Revelation not as a prediction of specific events, past or future, but as a symbolic portrayal of the timeless, ongoing spiritual conflict between good and evil, between God's kingdom and the forces that oppose it.
So the beast, Babylon, Antichrist, they aren't necessarily specific entities.
In the idealist view, they're recurring archetypes. They represent the kinds of opposition and temptation Christians face in every era. The book's purpose, then, is primarily spiritual encouragement and moral guidance for believers throughout history.
What's really interesting, though, is that many scholars today don't seem to stick rigidly to just one of these. They use what's called an eclectic approach.
That's right. It involves blending insights from different views. So, for example, you might acknowledge that the Roman Empire was almost certainly the primary first-century fulfillment of the beast, imagery that's using a preterist lens.
Okay.
But you could also see Rome as a pattern, an archetype, for all subsequent totalitarian regimes that demand absolute loyalty and persecute faith that brings in the idealist perspective.
And maybe it even points towards a final, ultimate antagonist yet to come.
Exactly, incorporating a futurist element, too. It allows for multiple layers of meaning and fulfillment.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, connecting back to what we said at the start. The profound impact of modern technology on how people, especially lay people, engage with these frameworks.
Yes, this is crucial.
Because for centuries, let's be honest, a strictly literal interpretation of some prophecies, like the mark of the beast, this idea of a single global system controlling all buying and selling, it just seemed technologically impossible, right?
Absolutely. Which naturally lent more weight to the symbolic interpretations offered by preterism or idealism. How could such a system realistically exist?
But now, suddenly in the 21st century, you see the emergence of things like AI-driven mass surveillance, talk of central bank digital currencies, biometric identification becoming commonplace, even implantable microchips. And for the first time, this convergence creates a plausible technological infrastructure for what could be seen as a literal global fulfillment of Revelation 13.
Precisely. This technological plausibility has powerfully revitalized the futurist interpretation, especially in the popular imagination. It's given it a jolt of, well, perceived relevance.
It shifts the debate, doesn't it?
It does. Suddenly, the discussion isn't purely theological anymore. It's also technological. People look at the headlines, they look at the tech being rolled out, and they see something that seems to map directly onto these ancient verses. This gives the futurist view a sense of immediate, almost urgent relevance that it simply didn't have for most of history.
Okay, so let's zoom in on one of Revelation's most iconic and, frankly, terrifying figures, the beast. Specifically, the first one mentioned in Revelation 13, the beast from the sea.
Right.
There seems to be a strong scholarly consensus that this figure originally referred to the Roman Empire. John describes it as this monstrous composite creature, part leopard, part bear, part lion.
Which isn't random imagery.
No, it directly echoes the descriptions of successive pagan empires in the Old Testament book of Daniel, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. It's portraying Rome as the culmination, the ultimate expression of godless imperial power up to that point.
And notice where his power comes from.
Yeah, that's chilling. It says its power, its throne, and great authority come directly from the dragon, who is later explicitly identified as Satan. It paints the Roman state not just as a political machine, but as a system energized by a spiritual power fundamentally hostile to God.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the part about the mortal wound that heals.
Right. One of its heads seemed to have a fatal wound, but the wound was healed, and the whole world marveled and followed the beast, even worshipped it. What's that about?
Well, historically, it's often linked to the Nero Redivivus myth, this popular belief or fear that the notoriously cruel Emperor Nero who had died would somehow return to life and power.
Like a counterfeit resurrection.
Exactly. A demonic parody of Christ's resurrection. More broadly, though, it points to the Roman emperor cult itself. This really intensified under Emperor Domitian, who reigned around the time Revelation was likely written. He was apparently the first emperor to demand the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, while still alive.
Which would put Christians in an impossible position.
Absolutely. For a Christian, there's only one Lord and God. Refusing to participate in the emperor cult wasn't just religious dissent. It was seen as treason, as atheism even, because they wouldn't acknowledge the state's gods.
And the beast is described as uttering haughty and blasphemous words and making war on the saints. That clearly reflects the reality of Roman persecution against Christians who refused emperor worship.
It fits the historical context very well.
So that's the original context. How does this ancient archetype of the beast get applied to our modern world, depending on which interpretive lens you use?
Okay, well, if you take the idealist perspective, the beast isn't a single person or nation. It's any political system, any ideology that deifies the state.
Meaning
Meaning when the government demands ultimate allegiance, when it presents itself as the source of salvation, security, and meaning, essentially taking the place of God. We saw clear examples in the 20th century totalitarian regimes, think Nazi Germany, Soviet communism. Today, proponents of this view might point to certain forms of aggressive secularism or political movements that seek to marginalize religious faith entirely, promising a purely political, earthly utopia as the solution to all human problems. The state becomes the ultimate authority on morality and truth.
Okay, that's the idealist view. What about the others?
Well, historicist and futurist interpreters are often looking for a more specific entity, a particular nation state, or even a global organization.
Like what?
In the past, as we mentioned, historicists pointed to the Holy Roman Empire or the papacy. Today, speculation, especially from a futurist perspective, often centers on global bodies like the United Nations or the European Union, seeing them as potential frameworks for a future one-world government prophesied in Revelation.
I've also heard people suggest the United States itself, connecting it more to the Babylon the Great figure, but sometimes linked to the beast system too.
Yes, particularly when looking at global economic and cultural influence. That interpretation's out there as well, viewing the U.S. as embodying the power and perhaps the haughty characteristics described.
But the interpretation that really grabs headlines, the one you see in movies and novels, is the beast as a single person, right? The Antichrist.
Absolutely. This is predominantly a futurist reading, often conflating the beast of Revelation with the figure of the Antichrist. The idea is that a singular, incredibly charismatic world leader will emerge, likely during a time of global crisis.
Promising solutions.
Exactly. Promising peace, security, solving intractable world problems. Maybe he brokers a peace deal in the Middle East, particularly involving Israel. He establishes a new global economic system. And ultimately, this figure rises to such power that he demands worship as God.
And people apply this to current leaders.
It happens frequently. For example, some commentators interpreted former U.S. President Donald Trump through this lens, seeing him as potentially an Antichrist-type figure. They would point to language perceived as haughty and blasphemous, and the intense, unwavering loyalty he inspires in his followers, perhaps echoing that cry in Revelation, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? Of course, that's just one interpretation reported by some observers.
It's important to clarify here, though, because there's often a lot of confusion. People throw around beast, Antichrist, man of sin. Are they all the same thing? Popular culture seems to treat them that way.
That's a really crucial point of confusion. And no, they're not strictly identical in the Bible, though they're clearly related concepts and might even culminate in a single end times figure.
Okay, break it down for us.
All right. The term Antichrist actually appears only in the letters of 1 John and 2 John. And there, John uses it to describe anyone who denies that Jesus Christ came in the flesh. It's primarily a doctrinal threat, a spirit of heresy. John even says many antichrists have come, suggesting it's a recurring issue, not just one future person.
So Antichrist, denial of Jesus' incarnation. Got it. What about the beast?
The beast from Revelation 13, as we've been discussing, is primarily an archetype of tyrannical political and military power. Its defining characteristic is that it demands worship, usurping the place of God through state power.
Political power demanding worship. Okay. And the man of sin.
That figure comes from Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians. He's also called the man of lawlessness. He represents ultimate religious apostasy. His defining act is seating himself in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. It's a religious deception, a claim to divinity from within a religious context.
So we have Antichrist, doctrinal denial, beast, political power demanding worship, and man of sin, religious figure claiming divinity. They're different facets.
Exactly. Different facets of opposition to God. Now, you could argue that the spirit of Antichrist, that underlying denial of Christ, provides the ideological foundation for the false prophet.
The second beast in Revelation 13.
Yeah, the one who promotes worship of the first beast. And the false prophet's work, in turn, props up the political beast's claim to total authority. So they're interconnected. Understanding these distinctions helps clarify why one person might see a modern leader as embodying an antichrist spirit in an idealist sense, anti-God values, while another is waiting for the antichrist, a specific, singular political religious figure in the futurist sense.
That distinction is really helpful. Okay, let's pivot back to the technology angle, because this is where things get particularly, well, contemporary. How does modern tech provide these startling analogies for Revelation's symbols of control?
Right, let's look at Revelation 13 again, specifically verses 14 and 15.
This is about the second beast, the false prophet, and the image of the beast.
Exactly. He commands the people of the earth to make an image to the first beast. But this isn't just a statue. The false prophet is given power to give breath. The Greek word is pneuma, spirit or breath, to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed.
For centuries, that must have sounded like pure supernatural magic or demonic illusion.
Precisely. But today, many interpreters, particularly futurists, look at this and see a prophecy of artificial intelligence.
How does that connection work?
Well, the act of giving breath, or pneuma, to an inanimate image is seen as this, well, almost blasphemous parody of God breathing life into Adam in Genesis.
A counterfeit creation.
Exactly. And modern interpreters see a powerful metaphor here for the creation of autonomous intelligent systems. AI seems to animate what was once inert machinery, giving the appearance of life, intelligence, even consciousness to things like robotics or digital avatars.
You think of those advanced humanoid robots, like Sophia, that can hold conversations, make facial expressions. She was even granted citizenship in Saudi Arabia. You can see how that blurs the lines, potentially creating an object of awe, maybe even a kind of technological worship.
It certainly blurs lines. And then there's the image's ability to speak. This finds a direct, almost literal parallel in today's advanced large language models, LLMs, and generative AI.
Like ChatGPT and others.
Yes. These systems can communicate with a level of sophistication that's often indistinguishable from humans. But more ominously, think about their potential for deception. They can be used to create and disseminate propaganda, deepfakes, hyper-realistic disinformation on an unprecedented scale.
Which aligns perfectly with the false prophet's described role to deceive the inhabitants of the earth.
It maps very closely. But perhaps the most chilling aspect is the image's function: to enforce worship of the first beast, the state or the leader, under penalty of death.
How does AI fit there?
This resonates strongly with the modern use of AI as a tool for mass surveillance and, crucially, ideological enforcement. The prime example often cited is China's social credit system.
Right, using facial recognition, data analysis.
Exactly. Vast networks monitor citizens' behavior, online activity, purchases, social interactions, political expressions. AI algorithms then assign a score. This score determines your ability to participate fully in society. Things like getting loans, booking travel, even job prospects. It effectively punishes dissent and enforces conformity to the state's ideology.
So in that model, the AI isn't just watching. It becomes the tireless, almost omniscient enforcer of allegiance to the political beast. That's genuinely chilling.
It really is. Now let's connect this to the other major symbol of control in Revelation 13, which follows immediately after the image, the mark of the beast. Verses 16 to 18. The false prophet causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of its name, which is 666.
The ultimate symbol of economic control.
Total economic control. And again, for futurist interpreters, the technological infrastructure for precisely this kind of system seems to be rapidly assembling before our very eyes.
Where do they see the parallels?
Well, the global trend away from physical cash towards digital transactions is seen as a crucial first step. Cash offers anonymity. Digital payments are inherently trackable.
But things like Bitcoin are decentralized, right?
They are, but the real focus of concern for many prophecy watchers isn't decentralized crypto, but the development of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
Explain those again.
A CBDC is digital money, yes, but it's issued and controlled directly by a government's central bank. This isn't just digital dollars in your account, it's potentially programmable money.
Programmable, what does that mean?
It means the central authority could, theoretically, build rules into the currency itself. They could track every transaction, potentially restrict what you can buy, where you can spend it, or even expire funds. They could instantly freeze or revoke a person's ability to transact for any reason, non-compliance, dissent, whatever.
That perfectly enables a system where you literally cannot buy or sell without approval.
It provides the exact mechanism described. And then you add in the increasing use of biometrics for payment and identification.
Like using your face or palm to pay.
Exactly. Amazon's palm scanning payment system, facial recognition being used by TSA at airports. These technologies link your unique biological data directly to your ability to engage in commerce and move freely.
And the fact that hand scanning is a prominent example that resonates with the prophecy mentioning a mark on the right hand.
It makes the connection seem very direct for many people. But for some, the ultimate fulfillment seems to point towards implantable technology.
This is where it gets really sci-fi for some people.
It can feel that way. Early versions we've already seen include things like voluntary RFID microchips may be implanted under the skin for accessing buildings or making small payments. But the advent of brain-computer interfaces, BCIs, like Elon Musk's Neuralink, that represents something far more profound.
How so?
A Neuralink-style device designed to interface directly with the brain could potentially merge human consciousness itself with the digital network. It could become the ultimate identifier and transaction tool. It could theoretically link one's thoughts, represented perhaps by the forehead in the prophecy, and one's actions, the hand, directly to a global financial and surveillance grid.
Making it a very potent candidate in the eyes of some for a literal technological mark the beast.
A very potent candidate, yes.
Okay, this brings us to a really interesting and pretty significant theological divide. Is the mark of the beast a literal piece of future technology? A chip? A digital tattoo, a biometric scan linked to a system? Or is it primarily a spiritual symbol?
That's the core debate, isn't it?
So let's look at the case for a literal technological mark. This is largely the futurist view, right?
Primarily, yes.
Proponents here argue that John, in his first century vision, saw a future reality far beyond his comprehension. He could only describe it using the language and concepts available to him, then a mark, a number.
So he was describing future tech in ancient terms.
That's the idea. And this stunning convergence we're seeing now, AI surveillance, CBDCs, biometrics, bioimplants, they see this as the actual literal end times fulfillment of this ancient prophecy taking shape. In this interpretation, receiving the physical mark, whatever form it takes, is viewed as an explicit, conscious, and unforgivable act of allegiance to the Antichrist and his system. It seals one's eternal fate.
A very serious interpretation.
Definitely. But then you have the case for a symbolic mark. This is more common among preterist and idealist interpreters.
Yes, though some futurists might also see symbolic layers, even if they expect a literal fulfillment. But primarily, preterists and idealists emphasize the symbolism.
What's their argument?
They argue that focusing obsessively on a specific future technology, like a microchip, risks missing the profound theological point John is making.
Which is?
Well, several things. First, the mark of the beast is seen as a direct, satanic parody of God's own seal. In Revelation, God places a seal on the foreheads of his followers, Revelation 7.3, 14.1, signifying his ownership and protection. The beast mimics this, marking his followers to show his ownership.
Okay, a counterfeit seal.
Second, the locations of forehead and the hand are seen as deeply symbolic, drawing on Old Testament passages like Deuteronomy 6.8. where God commands his people to bind his laws as symbols on their hands and foreheads.
So forehead represents
Thoughts, beliefs, worldview, inner allegiance, and the hand.
actions, works, behavior, how you live your life.
Exactly. So from this perspective, to receive the mark on the forehead and the hand means to dedicate your entire being, your intellect and your labor, your thoughts and your actions to the beast's anti-God system.
It's about total allegiance then, not just a transaction method.
Precisely. It's a deliberate, conscious, intentional act of worship and allegiance to the beast. It represents a fundamental rejection of Christ's lordship and a willing participation in a system defined by idolatry and rebellion against God. It's not something you could accidentally get, like, scanning your hand at the grocery store without realizing it. It involves conscious worship.
That makes sense as a symbolic reading. Now, you mentioned earlier how the image and the mark might be connected.
Yes, I think this is really important when we consider modern technology. While Revelation 13 presents the image of the beast and the mark of the beast sequentially, current trends suggest they might not be two separate things in practice, but potentially two integrated components of a single, overarching system of control.
How would that work?
You could understand the image, the speaking, enforcing entity as the AI-driven intelligent network, the overarching surveillance and ideological compliance system.
Okay, the AI brain, so to speak.
And the mark. That could be the digital or biological identifier, the CBDC account, the biometric data, the implant that plugs individuals into that system and enforces economic compliance.
So the image enforces belief. The mark enforces behavior through economics.
You could put it that way. And look again at systems like China's social credit model.
Right.
It already merges these functions, doesn't it? AI, the image, monitors behavior and assigns a score. That score, a form of the mark, then determines your economic freedom, your ability to buy and sell.
It's a feedback loop.
Exactly. In a potential future scenario, you could imagine a global AI managing a universal digital ID system. This system grants or denies access to the global economy based not just on financial status, but on an individual's measured ideological conformity, their alignment with the values of the beast's system.
So the AI image manages the mark, and the data from the mark feeds back into the image's assessment of you.
It becomes this symbiotic loop of total surveillance and control, a system of allegiance that seems to mirror quite closely what John described, where compliance in thought, worshiping the image, and action, taking the mark to buy and sell, are inextricably linked.
Wow. Okay, beyond the specific figures of the beast and the false prophet, Revelation paints a picture of another major player, this global system of seductive power personified as Babylon the Great.
Ah, yes, Babylon, another incredibly powerful symbol.
John's vision in Revelation 17 and 18 introduces this figure as a great harlot. She's described as being seated on many waters, which the angel explains represents the peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages of the world.
Showing her global influence.
Definitely. She's dressed in opulent luxury, purple, scarlet, gold, precious stones, pearls, but she's also drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And on her forehead, a name is written: Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth.
A terrifying combination of seduction and violence.
She represents a great city that, in John's time, reigns over the kings of the earth. She's the epicenter of a vast global economic system. When she falls, the kings of the earth weep, and the world's merchants mourn because no one buys their merchandise anymore.
Now, historically, the immediate anchor for this figure, given the description of the city ruling the world and persecuting Christians, was almost certainly Rome.
The capital of the empire?
Yes, its decadence, its idolatry, its brutality fit the description. However, by calling her Babylon, John deliberately evokes the memory of that Old Testament archetypal anti-God empire. Babylon was the power that destroyed Jerusalem and God's temple.
So using Babylon suggests Rome is just the current version of something bigger.
Exactly. It implies that Rome is the first-century manifestation of a larger, recurring spiritual and political reality, the seductive, idolatrous world system that opposes God and his people throughout history.
So if Rome was the original Babylon, how do people interpret Babylon the Great today? Who or what is modern Babylon?
Well, interpreters generally propose three main candidates for identifying modern Babylon.
What's the first?
First, some see Babylon as representing a specific modern superpower, and the one most frequently identified is the United States.
Why the U.S.?
Proponents point to America's dominant global economic power, its pervasive cultural influence, exporting entertainment, media, and values, often seen as immoral or materialistic worldwide, its unparalleled military might, and its status as a central hub for global trade, finance, and diplomacy. It seems to fit the description of a rich, influential city ruling over nations.
Okay, that's one view. What's another?
The second interpretation, which is perhaps increasingly prevalent, especially from an idealist perspective, argues that Babylon isn't a single nation. Instead, it's the spirit of the entire globalized system of consumer capitalism.
The whole world economy.
Essentially, yes. This Babylonish system, as they might call it, is characterized by its relentless pursuit of wealth and profit, its foundation in materialism, its tendency towards exploitation of labor and the environment, and its powerful ability to seduce people everywhere into finding their identity, meaning, and security in possessions and consumption rather than in God.
So from this viewpoint, anyone deeply invested in global consumer culture is participating in Babylon.
To some extent, yes. The system itself is seen as the harlot, seducing the nations.
Interesting. And the third main interpretation?
The third view focuses more on the harlotry aspect, interpreting it primarily as spiritual infidelity. In this reading, Babylon represents the totality of all false religious, philosophical, and ideological systems that stand in opposition to the true God. It's seen as a world empire of false religion.
How does that work?
This false religious system commits spiritual adultery by mixing elements of true worship, perhaps, with worldly politics, power, and values. It compromises truth for influence, creating a confusing and intoxicating blend that deceives the nations and leads them away from genuine faith. It could encompass everything from overt paganism to corrupted forms of major world religions to atheistic ideologies that function like religions.
So you've got a specific superpower, the global economic system, or a world system of false religion. Those are quite different takes.
They emphasize different aspects of the text, yes.
Now let's connect this back to the beast. These figures, the beast and Babylon, though they're distinct in the visions, seem deeply intrinsically linked, don't they?
Absolutely linked. You can think of them as representing two faces, or maybe two dimensions, of the same overarching anti-God world system.
How would you distinguish those faces?
The beast primarily represents the hard power of the state, coercive power, political, military, legislative force. It demands allegiance through fear, intimidation, and violence.
Okay, the fist.
While Babylon, the harlot, represents the soft power of culture and commerce. Seductive power, alluring, enticing. It demands allegiance not primarily through force, but through desire, promising pleasure, wealth, status, identity.
The open hand offering riches.
That's a good way to put it. And in our modern world, these two forms of power are truly inseparable, aren't they?
How so?
Well, the global consumer economy, Babylon, relies heavily on a stable political and military order. The beast to protect trade routes, enforce contracts, maintain financial systems, and generally provide the security needed for commerce to flourish.
Right. And the state needs the economy.
Exactly. The political power of the state, the beast, is funded and sustained by a thriving economy, Babylon through taxes, resources, and the general prosperity that keeps populations content. They need each other.
And crucially, bringing it back to tech again, those advanced technologies we discussed, AI, CBDCs, biometric IDs, they seem perfectly designed to serve both masters simultaneously.
Explain that.
Well, they can be used for overt political surveillance and control, enforcing the will of the beast just as easily as they can be used to create a seamless, efficient, global consumer experience, facilitating the seductive allure of Babylon. They empower both the iron fist and the velvet glove.
That's a really critical insight, which raises an important, maybe culminating question about the mark of the beast, doesn't it? If the beast and Babylon are so intertwined, and the technology serves both, then perhaps the ultimate mark of the beast shouldn't be understood merely as a political loyalty oath to a specific leader or state. Maybe it's something broader. Maybe it represents a full, willing, conscious buy-in to the entire interconnected system, economic, cultural, and political, that defines Babylon and the beast, the whole apparatus that stands in opposition to the kingdom of God.
So resisting the mark in that view isn't just about refusing a chip or defying a dictator.
It's also about resisting the seductive allure of materialism, consumerism, nationalism, self-deification, all the things that define the spirit of Babylon. It requires resisting the totalizing claims of both the coercive state and the seductive market. This really highlights the radical nature, the true cost of the allegiance Revelation calls for.
Wow. Okay, so stepping back from all these specific interpretations and technological parallels, Ultimately, the book of Revelation, with all its potent, sometimes disturbing imagery, it isn't primarily meant to be some kind of cryptographic puzzle for us to solve in the 21st century, is it?
No, I really don't think so. At its heart, it's a profound urgent call to radical allegiance and spiritual discernment for every generation that reads it, including ours.
So what's the fundamental question it's asking
The
us?
fundamental question Revelation poses, through all its dramatic visions of conflict between God and the forces of evil, isn't really when exactly will all this happen or what specific technology is the mark. The core question, echoed throughout the book, is much more personal and timeless. Whom do you worship? A stark choice. It presents two opposing figures and the kingdoms they represent. On one side, you have the Lamb who was slain, Jesus Christ, whose power is revealed in sacrificial love, whose followers are sealed by God as his own possession. On the other side, you have the beast, whose power is rooted in coercion, deception, and self-deification, and whose followers are marked for allegiance to its system.
So whether that mark is, a literal chip someday or a symbolic commitment we make today through our choices and values, the core challenge remains the same, doesn't it? Will we align our thoughts, our actions, our whole lives with a system that demands absolute loyalty on its own terms? Or will we align ourselves with the Lamb?
Precisely. And navigating the complex landscape of the 21st century with its powerful technologies, its shifting political currents, its pervasive consumer culture, it demands a posture that avoids both extremes. Neither technophobic panic on one hand, nor naive utopian acceptance on the other.
What does it require instead?
It requires critical thinking, yes, but also deep spiritual discernment. It compels you, the listener, to really analyze how these emerging technologies and evolving political and economic systems are shaping human values. How are they demanding allegiance, implicitly or explicitly? Do they support or undermine a life of faithful witness to the values of God's kingdom values like justice, mercy, humility, love?
So the challenge is ongoing.
It's ongoing. Whether the mark of the beast is ultimately a future microchip, a present-day ideology we embrace, or even just a historical memory that warns us, the fundamental challenge remains constant. To consciously resist those systems, political, economic, cultural privilege, that promise salvation through power, wealth, or technology, and instead to pledge our ultimate loyalty, our worship, to the kingdom of God revealed in Jesus Christ.
Which means the final apocalypse, that ultimate unveiling, isn't necessarily waiting for some future cataclysm of fire and brimstone. Perhaps the most important unveiling is the one happening right now, revealing where each person's true, deep allegiance really lies.